Okay, Martin, thank you very much for this conversation, for this opportunity to have this conversation about your a very good and actually an amazing book, Culture. Thank you very much. And this is my first question. When the culture is a good news, and an opposite, when is it not? When does culture do harm from your point of view?
First, Cristian, thank you very much for having this conversation with me. And as you know, it's a continuation of a conversation we had several years ago in Bucharest. So it's wonderful to talk to you again. Yes, I think it's a crucial question. And in some way, the book originated with when I noticed that if most of the talk today about culture is in some sense negative, as you say, there, you know, we talk about cultural wars or cultural appropriation, or when there's a problem in an organization or somewhere, you think, oh, it's a cultural problem. So a lot of our discussion about culture somehow locates problems there, and I started to realize that I sense that there's something wrong with that. Not always. I mean, there are negative aspects of culture. Not all is wonderful. But I felt that this was a kind of narrow view of culture, or too negative view of culture. But I realized that I didn't have a good, robust, even sort of theory of culture or understanding of culture, a good answer to the question, what is culture? And more important, perhaps even, how does it work? And so I realized that I had to kind of take a step back from all the contemporary, very heated debates about culture, and in some sense go back to first principle and ask myself, how does culture work? And in some sense, the book is a response to that. So I think my first instinct then was not to say when is culture good or bad, but more fundamentally, what is culture and how does it work? And I felt like that would put me in a better position to then adjudicate very contemporary questions about culture around such hot button issues as cultural appropriation or restitution of objects in museums and all these more charged questions.
And in other words, more precisely, more directly, what is culture for you? For you now, the definitions of culture could be a stepwise one by successive accumulation. Now, what is the culture for you?
Yeah. So culture for me is basically what we humans don't automatically, the broadest definition is what we humans don't automatically pass down through our genes, right? We are biologically the same humans as we were a couple of 100,000 years ago. That's biological evolution. We are the same. But we humans have embarked on a second trajectory, if you will, namely a cultural trajectory that's based not on our biological capacities, but on something we humans have made, technologies and knowledges we have accumulated, and that we, though, have to pass down to the next generation. Otherwise, it doesn't get passed down automatically. So this is why I focus on certain institutions, like everything from caves to universities that preserve and pass down this accumulated knowledge. Now, there's one more distinction I need to make, because, for example, science is also something that we accumulate and pass down, certain technological innovations, as I mentioned, and those are not, in a somewhat narrow sense, what I consider as culture. And for me, there's a distinction I make between know-how, which is a common term to describe scientific and technological knowledge that allows us to change, intervene in understand and intervene in the natural world, built technologies and so on and so forth. That's not culture in the more narrow sense. What I call culture is not know how, but know why. And that's essentially an ongoing struggle of meaning making. So that now we get into the realm of art and different humanities disciplines, different engagements with culture that in some sense is an orientation in the world that answers, though never finally, questions of meaning. And that's what I consider to be the domain of the arts and humanities and therefore culture.
Mm-hmm. Let me provoke you. In what other age or epochs or times and in what other countries actually, or regions would you have lived, would you have liked to live actually?
Oh, well, I mean, many. Well, certainly regions. I grew up in Europe, in Germany mostly. I lived for a little while in Italy, and I've been living mostly in the United States for the last 30 years. So I have this experience of moving from one culture to the next, and I think that's one reason why the book really emphasizes cultural contact, transference, the kind of cross-fertilization of different cultures. And I travel very widely, and that for me is very important, the experience of being not in the majority, to be part of a culture where you have to kind of try to figure things out, where you encounter things you don't expect and you don't know. That for me is a very basic source of pleasure. I think a very curious person. And I think in some sense, I use that attitude to look at culture, because there are lots of stories about travelers and translators and people who encounter an object from another culture and don't know what to do with it and then try to figure it out. And that is sort of the dynamic behind culture. Now, historical periods, basically any, I mean, the past is, however much we think we know about it, is there's so much we don't know. And in the book, because it's very narratively written, I tried to research as much as possible everyday culture and the lives of these historical characters. But it's very hard to know. For most of history, everyday life was not recorded. And so that's why I go sometimes to travelogues, ancient travelogues of a Chinese traveler who goes to India, or for example, novels or diaries, the wonderful diary written at the Japanese court around the year 1000 AD by Sei Shonagon, where suddenly you get a glimpse into that period of life. So you could throw me at any moment any of the chapters in some sense, because I felt like I spent so much time imaginatively trying to figure out what it would be like to live at these periods. So yeah, but thank you for this question. It's a wonderful question, and it I think responds to something that's very true about me as a personality, about my personality perhaps, or my experience. And something, I suppose, from that experience that found its way into the book.
Mm-hmm. In the lavish argument that you build up in the volume culture, you go to many different and sometimes exotic periods and history and areas. What does this navigation tell us about what culture really is? Actually.
Well, I think this has to do with, with culture, we always reproduce culture. We always try to connect to the past. We select from what remains of the past. So much gets forgotten, interruptions, things that get forgotten are lost and recovered. That's also another basic dynamic that I encounter everywhere. So culture for me at any moment is something that very much gets pieced together from fragments that appear somewhere. So we're always piecing things together. But in piecing things together, we also leave a lot of things out. So here we come to a kind of question that's sometimes described as a canon debate or a kind of major cultural history. And I think the reason why I go to some lesser known places that you describe as exotic is that I feel like our current cultural history is very stuck in a way. We have this sense of sort of one culture paving the way for the next, sort of Greek culture influencing Roman culture then influencing European culture, and so on and so forth, as if culture were sort of a baton, like a relay race right here in the end of the Olympics. The Greeks have the baton of culture. They pass it on to the Romans grab it, pass it on to the Europeans, and so on and so forth. And that I think is a fundamentally wrong view. It's much more interesting, I think, how culture actually works. And it has much more to do with unexpected encounters, something lost long ago that gets recovered and found again. And so once you start looking at culture from that perspective, very different kinds of episodes become quite important, and ones that certainly we in America and Europe know less about, like the Ethiopian Kebra Nagas, the ancient religious text of ancient Ethiopia that sort of connects to the Hebrew Bible, but then tells its own story of origin, stitching together pieces from other cultures. So that's something, the Kebra Nagas is very little known outside expert circles. So these are some of the stories I try to bring to the fore, because they, in some sense, to me, encapsulate this view of culture at least as good as some of the more familiar ones.
In what sense is culture a form of property? And the opposite, in what sense can culture not be owned as an owner by someone?
Yeah, Christian, this is a very good question, and I think one that was constantly on the back of my mind as I was trying to piece together that picture of culture that I then tried to capture in the book. And I think this comes from a very contemporary heated debate about maybe stronger somewhat in the United States than in Europe, but it's become more globalized, about cultural appropriation, which even has the term property in it. And I should say that I have a lot of sympathy for a lot of people who worry about appropriation, because this is a debate that comes to the fore, for example, when it comes to the restitution of cultural objects, that Western museums accumulated, that were often taken from the non-Western world under at least very dubious circumstances, and sometimes under circumstances of outright theft. And so there is a debate about the return of these objects. A prominent case in Europe is the Benin statues from Nigeria that were taken, for example, by German and British colonialists, and are prominently placed in museums in Berlin and in London and Paris. And so I'm very sympathetic for the restitution of these objects, because these were acquired under terrible circumstances. And I think, especially if you think of countries in Africa, I just mentioned the Kebra Nagas, that it's very clear that they not just have a right to these objects, but need them in order to understand their own cultural history and make that part of their living past. However, there are, I think, and this is something that became clear to me in writing the book, there are limits to the way this argument is made. Namely, this is ours, you took it from us, you have to return it to us. And the problem is precisely that is this conception of culture as property. And when I look at culture, I see so much movement, so much translation. One object gets carried, not stolen always, sometimes under conditions of violence or power imbalances. That's part of world culture also. So it's not always benign, but there's so much movement that you can look at any cultural tradition and you can see that it's composed of other cultural traditions that they themselves assembled and took and misunderstood and maybe appropriated or received as gifts and so on and so forth. There's this whole very broad canvas of the way in which cultures interact. And so that it became clear to me that in the last instance, if you insist that culture is the property of groups and their ancestors, you have a very impoverished understanding of culture that I think in the end is bad for everyone. So to return this to the question of the restitution of objects, I'm totally for Nigeria to get a good number of these Benin statues back, but ultimately I think the goal should be actually more circulation of objects, not less. Not we send everything back where it came from, and then everyone has their own stuff. That is that kind of impoverished understanding of culture, I think. Rather, I think there should be better forms of circulation, less exploitative forms of circulation. So more circulation, because that for me is one of the big upshots. It's the driving dynamic of cultural thriving, is borrowing, is openness, is not, this is mine, you stay in your lane, I stay in my lane. That I think curtails, it diminishes, it throttles the main dynamic of cultural development.
Mm-hmm. A question inspired by Margaret Atwood. What will libraries look like in 2114? And what about those of 2500? Does it make sense to ask you such a question? Last question, actually.
Yeah, no, I mean, it goes back to one of the core questions asked, namely, how is culture preserved and transmitted? How does it survive? I think about time capsules, some natural time capsules, like when cave paint, when prehistoric caves get closed up and get preserved for like 30,000 years into the present. So I love, and I find these very important. So I would say that's what continues to that will have to happen for culture to survive. We will need forms of storage. And by the way, electronic storage is great in some ways and terrible in other ways. So different forms of knowledge and access to knowledge, I think that is, we are constantly evolving new ones. I think even now AI is actually one, I've created some of these AI chatbots that allow you to talk to Socrates and others. That's a new form of preserving and activating knowledge. So I'm invested in that principle. And libraries have been for the last, libraries have existed for about 3,000 years. Let's say they have been a crucial form of storing knowledge. But I think it's fine if there are other forms, because words get preserved differently. I think we should be open that libraries will change. The one caveat is that, and I've thought about this in other contexts, there are several huge problems with electronic storage. Well, the great thing about electronic storage is that it's so cheap. And creating libraries, storing knowledge has, for most of human history, has been very costly. Lots of resources went into it. And that also meant that a lot had to be left out. Electronic storage, the costs are almost going down to zero. So that's a big change. But there are huge problems with it. And the main one is the obsolescence of electronic formats. Think of we're both old enough to have a bunch of floppy disks, probably, hanging out in the basement or they've become essentially illegible. So many online databases are no longer accessible. They are orphan sites floating around in the ether. So librarians say that for all the huge advantages of electronic storage, printing things out, paper and books continue to be actually crucial to some extent because of the obsolescence of electronic file formats. So in that sense, maybe the libraries of the future won't look so different from the way they do now, namely some combination of paper and print storage, physical storage, and electronic storage in some combination.
So, in other words, what do you think? Will AI, intelligence artificial, simplify or complicate things about culture produced by humans?
I think it will change things. I mean, so I think of AI, and I'm just sort of groping my way to a potential book project on it because I think it's fascinating. The way I think of AI is actually not some new alien form of intelligence that's emerged and that we now have to figure out how am I going to relate to these kind of Frankenstein creatures that have popped up somehow, that have emerged in Silicon Valley and are now taking over the world. I think of AI as very differently. I actually think that what AI shows that we are artificially intelligent to a very serious extent, namely precisely to the extent that we rely on culture that is human-made artifacts. The Italian philosopher Vico basically defined the humanities as the study of human-made artifacts, and I think that's crucial for me too. That's another definition of culture that's, I think, it's not the natural world, it's what we humans have made. And that's all based on technologies and artifacts and props, if you will. And so I think AI is just an extension of that. It's yet another form in which this artificial form of intelligence that is available to us through language and writing and other symbols will now interact with that store of knowledge. And so this is why I started to create these customized GPTs, because I was very interested in how you can train AI chatbots to access a particular corpus of text, let's say the Platonic dialogues, and how to reconfigure access to that. And it's also a great pedagogical device for my students. But I've been very interested in that. So I'm not saying AI is all good. I think that it will create huge disruptions to the labor force. It's a big technological disruptive change, probably. But I don't think it's helpful to have these science fiction scenarios. I think all our heads are full of science fiction scenarios. Actually, large language models are full of science fiction scenarios. And I think they can be very misleading. I think of it more as actually an extension of what some of my previous work has been on writing technologies and now on culture, which is on artifacts. And I think it comes out of that. It, in some sense, reconfigures that in ways that I think we are all just starting to grapple with. But we in the arts and humanities, I think we need to be more engaged with that because it's actually something that should be that's close to what we do in some sense, precisely because we, rather than the natural sciences, are concerned with cultural objects and texts and language-based intelligence and all of these things that AI taps into.
Yes. From your point of view, what feeds these feelings and these narratives of cultural apocalypse, let's say part-time apocalypse?
Yeah, I'm as susceptible to apocalyptic scenarios as anyone. And I notice, I've written a little book on climate change that talks a lot about the flood stories from the Epic of Gilgamesh through the Hebrew Bible and so on and so forth. This apocalyptic catastrophic thinking, I think, is a very deep part of cultural history, especially in the Judean Christian tradition because of the flood story, but you find that in many other cultures as well. And it makes for great Hollywood cinema, of course, these, everything coming down. I've become, even though we live in a time with multiple crises, and I'm not saying there's a lot of reason to be super optimistic about lots of things, but I think these catastrophic narratives, I really have come to think that they are very misleading. They are kind of theological form of narrative that I think can be misleading. They can be debilitating. They can breed, for example, in an environmental context, a kind of helplessness, a kind of doomerism, and so I've become very skeptical of them, especially in the two areas where I've thought a lot most about, which is climate change and AI. And it's interesting that I think today, if you just look at an average newspaper, those are the two areas I think where apocalyptic narratives are most strong in both the popular imagination and in the way journalists write about it, but also in which ordinary humans, and I very much include myself, I'm also susceptible to them. But I think actually I've become very skeptical of it, and that's, I think, one small role that we as cultural historians can play, is namely actually to show the history of these, of where something like an apocalyptic imagination comes from. And I think understanding where it comes from, how it functions, is at least a way of maybe taking a step back.
So, do the humanities really decline? You say at the end of this very beautiful book, an addicted book, you said that you had the revelation of this book after a dinner where, if I am not mistaken, you deplored, not only you actually, the twilight of culture. So, do the humanities really decline?
Yeah. It is, as you say, people in arts and culture, I'm sure, I wonder whether you've been part of these conversations as well, but I think many of us have. The decline, so that means the decline of the enrollment in at universities in the humanities. That is certainly a steep decline there. That's without question. The role of the arts and humanities in universities has deeply declined. So, I've been bemoaning this, but then I realized at some point I didn't have a bigger picture. And that's when I tried to figure out what the arts and humanities really are. And that's how I came to this much bigger project on culture. And so I think that actually it's helped me also see that while it's true that the humanities are declining just in terms of enrollment and size, let's say, in universities, very starkly in the United States. And I'd be curious to see how it is in Romania, for example. That actually the university humanities, the academic humanities, are only perhaps a relatively small part of it. And if you look at a bigger picture that includes, book publishers like Trei and public debates and so on and so forth, you actually realize that there, all these podcasts that have sprung up everywhere, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people listening to, making podcasts, that there's actually outside the humanities, I think, outside the universities, the arts and humanities are much broader and in some sense thriving, not everywhere, but there is, I think, a much broader picture. So if we just look in our small backyard, namely the university, we may actually not get a full picture. And I also think that it's actually quite different in different countries. That, I'm on the board of a university in Germany, and there the humanities are not declining as rapidly. I'm a fellow at Queen Mary. There, the humanities are struggling very much. And so anyway, I think it's also different countries are in different positions there.
We produce culture, so we destroy culture. It is fair, it is right to formulate in this way.
Yeah, it's true that one of the through lines, I tended to think of culture as sort of traditions. That goes back to the passing of the baton kind of Olympic relay race kind of picture of culture. And that suggests that that the essential mode is preservation. You have the baton, someone else takes it, no one drops it. But as happened once or twice in relay races in the Olympics, in truth, the baton gets dropped all the time. And sometimes, I suppose, by force, when someone knocks it out of your hand and one culture invades the other, and a lot of cultural objects get destroyed deliberately. That happens a lot. It happens, for example, when the Spaniards came to the New World and encountered this marvelous culture, the Mayan culture and the Aztec cultures, both of them very elaborate, and they basically destroyed both of them. Though it's also hard to destroy something completely. So it's interesting that things get preserved, things get rediscovered, things get preserved in indirect ways and revived later. We see that also with both Maya and Aztec culture. I spent a couple of days in a Maya village in the Lancadon jungle, and you realize there's actually a lot that gets preserved. But a lot gets also destroyed, as you say, Christian, sometimes deliberately, through acts of violence and then vandalism, though actually the Vandals aren't quite as bad as they always said to be. The Vandals were themselves creators of culture, but get destroyed, sometimes more often through, actually, I think through neglect, because a culture no longer cares about a certain thing or a certain type of art or a certain cultural practice, and then it just sort of withers away. It can happen very quickly, because culture does need to be passed down from generation to generation, sometimes through natural catastrophes, like a volcano erupts and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot of destruction, both willful and sort of through neglect or cultural forces. I think that's everywhere. And that's when you have that dynamic that became crucial for me, where you encounter something, sometimes after a long hiatus, you find something underground, or you encounter something that survived and you don't know what it is.
Martin, is culture, it's like a provocation actually, is culture the nature, the human nature, equally than human nature?
I think it is, in the sense that, as I said, we are sort of composed of these two evolutions, if you will. There's biological evolution that's described by genetics and DNA and Darwin and all of that, and we humans have changed very, very little. Not at all. There are certain cultural adaptations, like, for example, lactose tolerance, that adults can digest milk. That obviously something that is a kind of our biological makeup adapting to a cultural innovation in the animal husbandry, cows and so on and so forth. But these are really relatively small exceptions. There's also a sense that certain and some evolutionary biologists have very interesting research on it, that while the actual DNA adaptations like lactose tolerance exist, they're very small. There's a much larger sense of where cultural environments have a lot to do with whether certain genes get switched on or off. So there's a second way in which culture impacts our biological makeup, so to speak. But this more simpler argument to make this is simply that if you imagine, and 18th century scholars always had this fantasy, if you locked a human in a human baby and didn't expose it to language and all the other, it basically didn't expose it to culture, that poor creature would not really resemble our lives and what we know and how we interact. There's so much that's learned about humans. And so in that sense, it has become second nature, I think is a good description. But it's always important to remember its fragility, and the fact that the computer just crashed is perhaps a good example of that, that it's not automatic. It's not natural in the sense that we have the capacity, I think, if you isolated a group of humans, killed everyone else, and then let them loose onto the world, they would, because we are social creature and so on and so forth, cultural evolution would immediately start again. In that sense, there's certainly that capacity for it is, grounded in our biology, but it's not, we cannot take culture for granted. And that's why it's so important to support it, to think about how it's passed down. That's why education is so important, why institutions, you mentioned libraries, are so important. We can't treat it as a given.
So syncretism, or what opposes it, to whom the future belongs.
Yeah, that's
way. Okay.
Say it again. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Realistical way and in idealistical way.
Oh, realistical way and idealistic. Yeah. So I think that what became clear to me is that the people, they're sort of right now, at least in the US, and I think you can find versions of that in other parts of the world as well, but I think it's good to be culturally specific. There are sort of two positions that are against syncretism. The one is a kind of nationalism or ethno-nationalism that tries to focus on completely simplified notions of, us, we are the X people and this is our culture, and you can do your own thing over there, but we here, you're only doing this one thing. So a kind of ethno-nationalism, or also you could say a tribalism, depending on the political context. So that's usually seen as a right or right-wing position. That's a certain simplification perhaps, but more or less. There's also a left-wing version of it, and that goes back to the kind of cultural appropriation argument, where there's also coming, I think, from a very good place, trying to preserve minority cultures and so on and so forth, cultures that are seen as under threat. But again, creating this kind of group identity through a culture and saying, you guys need to stay away from this, this is ours, and everything else is cultural appropriation. So I think there is a misguided version of that also on the left, though globally speaking, I think the right-wing form is much, much stronger and certainly much more destructive. But I think both of them are in some sense against the syncretism. And I think that they are, even if it comes from a good place, a preservation of culture, and there are conservative forms of anti-syncretism that also, I think, are generally concerned with preservation and so on and so forth. I think it ultimately, it's the wrong position to take, because, as I said, it just goes, that's not how culture works and thrives. Preservation, yes, but simplifying, keeping other influences out, that's always going to have a negative impact in the long run. It deprives you in your own culture of all these other encounters you can have. I think it's impoverishes. It fundamentally impoverishes, no matter what the motivation behind it, whether it's a kind of positive preservation or love for a certain tradition or concern about protecting it against some evil outside force. I think in the long term, it will have a negative impact. And in some sense, that's, I think, that's the conviction I came to, and that's what I want to proselytize that view. Now, the realistic speaking is that, of course, and I don't even have to look. You don't have to look in the future. You can look in the past. That this kind of anti-syncretist movement is always very strong, and especially in moments of crisis where people tend to kind of fall back on what they know, where it's very easy to identify scapegoats. So my fear is and that's why I think the anti-syncretism has been on the rise in different political guises, is that it's in a very complex, interconnected, crisis-prone world that can seem as the antidote, that can create a feeling of belonging and safety that I understand, and that I also sometimes are prone to. I include myself here, but ultimately based at least on the understanding of culture I have come to, it's the wrong way.
Two more questions for fine-tuning of our wonderful conversation. One is this: there is a Romanian thinker who, and now I quote, who said, only gods and animals do not need books. Paraphrase: only gods and animals do not need culture. Is that so, or is that too nicely put, too nicely says?
No, I think that's wonderful, and you need to tell me who that is. I think that's wonderfully put. Now, animals, of course, have, in a very small way, also, their chimpanzees, mothers teach their young certain techniques, certain grooming. I mean, as with all things, we are animals. It's very hard to draw a very, very hard line between us and related species. We know about more about whale language than we did before. So some of the features that have catapulted us onto this kind of cultural path in very small ways are true for some other species. So, but with that caveat, I think that it's very true that we are the species that has been shaped by culture and not other species. It's who we are. It's who we are. Mm-hmm. Who is that thinker?
The name is Pătrăconiu, as a very controversial thinker and a very big character in the, let's say, the last 70 years of Romanian cultural.
Well, I'd love to meet him and debate.
It's like a Socrates without written opera, without the written, not with an oral aura, let's say, and it's a big figure. So, and the last one is this one question: is our culture, the culture we produce and we propagate, an argument of our fragility, or the opposite, an argument of our power, of our strength, or maybe both?
I haven't quite thought about it that way, but it's a great question to ask. I suppose one would, and the question implies that one have to say that it's both a question of strength, of this capacity, and if you look at cultural history, it's amazing what we humans collectively have wrought, what we have made, what we have created, and even though so much has been lost, if you do this kind of big picture view of culture, as I do, you become very aware of how much has been lost and how fragile culture is. I think that's without doubt, that culture is very fragile and can easily, that's a theme that I've sounded several times here, I think, in this conversation, how easily it's lost, destroyed, and so on and so forth. But your question was a little bit different, was not about the fragility of culture, but about us. Is it an expression of our fragility as humans? And I think that's a really neat way of putting it. And I suppose one could say that what I've been describing as the fragility of culture, of cultural objects, is a fragility of us to the extent that we are not physically dependent on culture, but as human beings actually dependent, because we are this culture producing species. And to the extent also maybe tied back to my initial definition of culture as know why, rather than just know how, the technical knowledge, that intervenes, which also has to be preserved and can be lost or refound. It follows the same transmission dynamics, so to speak, of art and culture. But the meaning making is an expression of, I think, also of our fragility, that because we know about our mortality, unlike other species, we are engaged in that because we are disoriented in that sense. Are we trying to orient ourselves? Because we raise the question of meaning, are we struggling to arrive at meaning? And that, I think you're so right that this can be described both as a strength and a weakness, a strength and the particular fragility that we feel, where we feel like we don't, where do we belong? Between animals and gods goes back to where is our position? And so that fundamental, existentialists have written in a certain way about it. But so I think that's a really great question, Cristian. And I want to think more about that. I think that's a really gets at a very profound point.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you for this conversation. A great honor for me again. And really, thank you again for this book, Culture, published by Trei Publishing House in Romania. Thank you very much, and maybe we'll meet again very soon.
I hope so very much. Thank you also to the translator. I think translators are some of the unsung heroes in the book. There are lots of translators who featured in this book. So I want to, and it's what makes literature a global commodity, if you will. Do you want to read the name of the translator?
This Radu Șorop, translated from English into Romanian, this very, very beautiful and this amazing book. Thank you very much.
Thank you.